Imagine waking up every day knowing that you have no freedom. You live in a world where your life isn't your own, and everything you do is controlled by someone else. This was a harsh reality for millions of people who were slaves in ancient Rome. But did you know that being a slave in ancient Rome wasn't always what we think? It wasn't all chains and darkness. Some slaves actually lived quite differently than you might expect. So, let's step back in time and see what life was really like for a Roman slave. Trust me, you'll be surprised. To fully understand what it was really like to be a Roman slave, we need to step back and look at the Roman Empire as a whole. Ancient Rome was one of the most powerful and influential civilizations to ever exist, and a large part of its success was due to the labor of slaves. But the lives of these slaves were far from uniform. They worked in different jobs, lived in different conditions, and some even had opportunities for freedom and success. Their stories are more complex and diverse than you might imagine. 1. How did people become slaves in ancient Rome? Before we dive into the daily lives of Roman slaves, it's important to understand how people became slaves in the first place. Slavery in Rome wasn't based on race, as we often think of slavery today. It was more about status, power, and wealth. There were several different ways people could find themselves in this position. War and conquest. The most common way people became slaves was through war. Rome was constantly expanding its empire, fighting wars with other nations and conquering lands. When the Romans defeated an enemy, they would take the survivors as prisoners of war and bring them back to Rome as slaves. These slaves came from all over the ancient world, from Gaul, modern-day France, Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, Greece, the Middle East, and beyond. Prisoners of war were marched in chains through Roman streets and sold in slave markets to the highest bidder. But being a prisoner of war didn't always mean a life of misery. Some slaves gained their freedom through hard work or by proving themselves to their masters. Many others, however, lived out their lives in servitude, forced to work the fields, fight as gladiators, or serve wealthy families. Debt slavery. Another way people could end up as slaves was through debt. If someone borrowed money and couldn't repay it, they could be sold into slavery to pay off their debts. The harshness of the system meant that people who were struggling to survive could be trapped in a cycle of poverty and servitude. This often meant that people could lose their homes, families, and their entire futures just because they didn't have enough money to pay a debt. In some cases, entire families could be enslaved if the head of the household was unable to pay back loans. Born into slavery. The most unfortunate way to become a slave was to be born into it. In ancient Rome, if your mother was a slave, you were a slave as well. This was known as hereditary slavery. Children born as slaves had no chance of freedom unless they were granted manumission, the act of being freed by their owner. These children grew up in slavery, knowing from the moment they were born that they would have no freedom of their own. This meant that generations of families could be trapped in servitude for decades or even centuries. 2. What was the life of a Roman slave like? Now that we understand how people became slaves, let's take a closer look at what their actual lives were like. Contrary to what many believe, not all slaves in ancient Rome lived in misery. In fact, some had relatively comfortable lives. Their experiences depended largely on their masters, the type of work they did, and the social class they belonged to. Household slaves. These were the slaves who worked inside the homes of wealthy Roman families. Their tasks included everything from cooking and cleaning to managing the household and looking after children. Household slaves were often treated somewhat better than slaves who worked in the fields or mines. They lived inside the house, had their own quarters, sometimes even private rooms, and were allowed to wear good clothing. They could also eat better food and enjoy a higher standard of living compared to other slaves. However, despite these privileges, household slaves still had no freedom. They were under the control of their masters and were often expected to work long hours. Some of these slaves had close relationships with their masters, and in rare cases, could even gain their freedom or earn money for their services. Agricultural slaves. The majority of slaves in ancient Rome worked on farms or estates. These slaves led some of the hardest lives. They worked from sunrise to sunset, doing backbreaking labor in the fields, planting crops, and tending to animals. Many agricultural slaves lived in harsh conditions, with little to no comfort. They often slept in small, crowded huts, with very few possessions to their name. The work was exhausting and dangerous, especially in the Roman summer heat. Slaves in the fields didn't have the same chances to escape their lives as some of the household slaves. Their lives were often defined by constant work and little rest. They had no real hope of freedom unless their masters chose to free them, which for many never came. Public slaves. Public slaves worked for the Roman state, maintaining public buildings, roads, aqueducts, and other infrastructure. They were responsible for building and maintaining the very systems that allowed Rome to function as an empire. While public slaves may not have experienced the same degree of personal abuse as other slaves, their lives were still difficult. The work was often dangerous, and they were subject to the whims of Roman officials. However, public slaves did have some rights in the sense that they worked for the government rather than for private owners, which meant they sometimes received better treatment. Gladiators. Gladiators are some of the most famous slaves in Roman history. These slaves were trained to fight in the arena, often risking their lives for the entertainment of Roman citizens. While some gladiators became famous and gained a degree of respect, they were still slaves. The life of a gladiator was brutal, and many of them fought to the death. But in rare instances, gladiators could win their freedom if they fought well enough in the arena. However, most gladiators spent their lives fighting, knowing that each day could be their last. 3. The hardships of slavery. Even though some slaves had more comfortable lives than others, the majority of slaves in Rome faced extreme hardships. Slaves were considered property, not people, and had no rights. Their lives were completely controlled by their masters, and they could be punished, beaten, or even killed for disobedience or failure to meet their masters' expectations. Punishments. Slaves who made mistakes or angered their masters could be severely punished. Punishments range from physical beatings to more severe forms of punishment, like being sold to a different master or, in extreme cases, being executed. Running away from your master was also considered a serious crime, and slaves who tried to escape were often caught and punished severely, sometimes even killed. Separation from families. Another hardship slaves faced was a constant threat of being separated from their families. Because slaves were considered property, they could be sold off at any time, and often families would be torn apart as different members were sold to different masters. The emotional toll of the separation was immense, as many slaves had no hope of ever being reunited with their loved ones. 4. The good side of slavery. Despite the hardships, there were some positives in the lives of certain slaves, especially those who worked in wealthier homes or had special skills. While not all slaves were treated the same, some did enjoy privileges that made their lives easier. Manumission. Some slaves were able to buy their freedom or were granted freedom by their masters. This process, known as manumission, allowed slaves to become free citizens after years of hard work. Manumission wasn't guaranteed, but for those who were able to earn it, freedom was a possibility. A freed slave could live their life as they chose, and many freed slaves went on to become wealthy and powerful individuals. Skilled slaves. Slaves with special skills, such as being doctors, teachers, or artisans, often had better living conditions. These slaves could sometimes earn money and have a higher standard of living. Some even had the chance to save up enough to buy their freedom. Skilled slaves were valued for their expertise and could be trusted with important tasks. Some even became respected members of Roman society. 5. The role of slaves in Roman society. Slaves played a vital role in Roman society. They worked in almost every field, from agriculture and construction to education and medicine. Without their labor, Rome would not have been able to grow into the vast empire that it did. Slaves in the economy. Slaves were the backbone of the Roman economy. They worked in fields, built roads and aqueducts, and served as craftsmen and laborers. Many slaves were also involved in trade, working as merchants or assistants to wealthy businessmen. Slaves contributed to the empire's success by providing the labor that kept the economy running. 6. What happened after slavery? When a slave was granted their freedom, life wasn't always easy. Freedmen still faced discrimination from Roman society. They were often looked down upon by the elite and treated as second-class citizens, even though they had earned their freedom. However, Many freedmen managed to make their mark on Roman society. Some of them became wealthy, and even a few rose to positions of power. Freed slaves were still considered outsiders, but they could own property, start businesses, and contribute to Roman culture. Further exploration of Roman slavery. While we discuss how slavery in ancient Rome was a key part of the empire's function, there's so much more to explore regarding the daily lives of slaves, their relationships, and even their personal struggles for freedom. These aspects are often overshadowed by the brutality of slavery, but they were an essential part of the story. 7. Slaves and family life. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Roman slavery was the inability to form permanent families. Though some slaves found ways to love and care for each other, their relationships were always fragile. A slave might find a partner and even have children, but they knew that their family could be torn apart at any moment. Children born to slaves were automatically slaves themselves. So, a mother or father might find themselves bound to a life of servitude with their children, with little hope of breaking the cycle. Marriages were not legally recognized for slaves in ancient Rome, and any union could easily be broken up by the sale of one of the partners. This meant that the family unit for many slaves was always in a state of uncertainty. The emotional toll of this instability is unimaginable, as it's hard to feel secure when your family could be sold off at any time. That said, some slaves still managed to form close-knit, supportive communities. Slaves in households or on farms would often band together for mutual support. They would help each other through tough times and provide emotional comfort when things got difficult. These informal families provided the only real sense of belonging and solidarity that many slaves had. Some slaves even worked together to save money, buy their freedom, or escape from their masters. 8. Slave revolts and resistance. Although most slaves in ancient Rome didn't have the opportunity to rebel or rise up, there were moments in history when large-scale resistance took place. One of the most famous slave revolts was the Third Servile War, led by Spartacus. Spartacus was a gladiator who managed to escape and form an army of slaves who fought against the Roman military for years. Spartacus's revolt was a turning point in Roman history. Though it was ultimately crushed by the Roman forces, it showed the power of a united slave population. Thousands of slaves joined Spartacus, and the revolt caused great panic within the Roman elite. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but became a symbol of hope and resistance for slaves everywhere. Beyond major revolts like the one led by Spartacus, slaves also found ways to resist in more subtle ways. Some would sabotage their work, break tools, or delay tasks, effectively slowing down production and frustrating their masters. Others would run away, although this was a dangerous option, as escapees were often caught and punished severely. Running away was risky, but for some slaves, it was their only option for a better life. In Roman society, there were also instances of slaves quietly defying their master's authority. Some slaves became educated, learning to read and write, skills that were not typically taught to enslaved people. These educated slaves were able to communicate with other slaves and even plan for their freedom. Others used their education and skills to gain a more important position within the household, eventually earning enough trust to gain more privileges or, in some cases, even buy their freedom. 9. The role of religion and beliefs. Religion also played a significant role in the lives of Roman slaves. Many slaves were brought from different parts of the Roman Empire, each with their own traditions and beliefs. Over time, some slaves became connected with Roman religious practices, especially those linked to the Roman gods and goddesses. For some slaves, religion provided a sense of comfort and escape from the harsh realities of their lives. The Roman Empire also had a complex view of slaves in religious terms. Some slaves were even granted certain privileges during religious festivals or ceremonies. The Saturnalia, for example, was a festival during which the social order was temporarily overturned, and slaves could briefly enjoy freedom. During this time, slaves might be served by their masters, allowed to dress in fine clothing, and even engage in role reversal ceremonies. Though this was a temporary break from the typical social structure, it gave slaves a glimpse of what a life of freedom might feel like. Some slaves also sought refuge in the early Christian church, which, in the first few centuries, was a growing force in the Roman world. Christianity offered hope to many slaves, teaching that God valued all people equally, regardless of their social status. The idea that they were loved and cared for by God, even if their earthly masters treated them poorly, provided comfort to many enslaved individuals. In fact, Christianity played an important role in changing how some viewed slavery in the long run, as Christian teachings began to spread and challenge the foundations of the Roman slave system. 10. Slaves and Roman entertainment. While we often think of gladiators when we imagine entertainment in ancient Rome, it's worth noting that not all slaves were used for fighting in the arena. Some slaves were entertainers in other forms, including musicians, dancers, and actors. These slaves often found themselves in a very different kind of servitude. Some of these entertainers had a better life than the average agricultural or household slave. If they were particularly talented, they could find themselves performing for the wealthy elite in private homes or public theaters. These slaves often gained fame in their own right, and their talent could lead to better living conditions or the possibility of gaining freedom. For example, some performers were able to negotiate for their freedom after years of service, or in rare cases, they were given their freedom as a reward for their skill. Still, their lives weren't without struggle. Performers and entertainers were often seen as expendable, much like gladiators. Their worth was only in their ability to entertain and provide for the pleasure of others. But some entertainers found ways to gain power, wealth, and influence, using their skill to rise above their circumstances. For these slaves, the arena of entertainment was not just a stage for their talents, but also a chance to shift the balance of power in their favor, even if only temporarily. Now that we've explored various aspects of Roman slavery, including the social, emotional, and economic factors, we can better understand the complexity of their lives. The lives of Roman slaves weren't just marked by suffering. They were also shaped by moments of resistance, cunning, and survival. Some slaves became powerful figures in their own right, while others struggled to make it through each day. This complex and multifaceted system provides us with an important lesson about the human spirit and how it can endure under extreme circumstances. The resilience of Roman slaves is a testament to their strength, their desire for freedom, and their ability to adapt to a system that tried to strip them of their dignity. So, what was it really like to be a Roman slave? The truth is, their lives were far more complex than we might assume. While many slaves in ancient Rome lived under oppressive conditions, forced to endure grueling work and harsh treatment, others found ways to survive and even thrive in a system built on their subjugation. The lives of Roman slaves were a blend of hardship and occasional opportunity, struggle and resilience, all tied together by the common thread of survival against overwhelming odds. We've seen how some slaves managed to build relationships and create tight-knit communities, finding comfort and solidarity in each other's company, while others resisted through small acts of defiance or even large-scale revolts like Spartacus's legendary uprising. And while many were trapped by the brutal system of servitude, others achieved the rare, but not impossible, feat of earning their freedom. This potential for liberation, albeit difficult and rare, offered a glimpse of hope in the otherwise grim existence many slaves faced. One of the most striking aspects of Roman slavery is how it challenges our expectations. Slaves were not just passive victims of their circumstances. They were active participants in shaping Roman society. They worked in every corner of the empire, from farms and households to mines and entertainment arenas, contributing to the economy and culture in ways that often went unnoticed. Despite being regarded as property, many slaves managed to create legacies that transcended their status, with some even rising to positions of power and respect. Roman slavery was a system that dehumanized millions of people, but also revealed the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Through resistance, rebellion, and hope of freedom, slaves in ancient Rome proved that no matter how harsh the system, the will to fight for dignity and self-determination can never be fully crushed. If you're captivated by the stories of resistance, survival, and the incredible journeys of these slaves, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating insights from history. There's so much more to uncover about the hidden figures who shaped the world we know today.